Thank you, Chaplain Black. It's always a tremendous privilege to come back up to the Senate at your invitation. Thank you. All of you who are contributing your time and your wisdom and your energy in this historic building, you hardly need to be reminded that we are living at a solemn moment for the American Republic. The Western world is in decline. The search for a new world order is faltering. The global agenda is overburdened with unprecedented challenges. And as we look to the future, people are talking how the conquest of nature is soon to lead to the conquest of human nature, and as C.S. Lewis put it, maybe even to the abolition of man. And here in this country, the great American Republic, which George Washington called the great experiment in freedom, history's longest-running public tutorial in the art of political freedom, is suffering its gravest crisis since the Civil War. And by that I mean something far deeper than just the events of the last week, and certainly far deeper than all the criticisms that's swirling around the present administration. From a foreign perspective, what is the nature of the challenge, and why is it so serious? I would argue that the deepest division is not left versus right, not urban-rural or coastlanders and heartlanders, and not even the new division between nationalists and populists and globalists. But the deepest division goes back to views of the American Republic and of freedom, some of which go back to 1776 and the American Revolution, and many of which go back, often unawares to the people who hold the ideas, to 1789 and the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. And depending on which view of the Republic and which view of freedom you take, they come out in extraordinarily different positions. I would also argue that part of the problem is that this time, although the divisions are almost as deep as just before the Civil War, as yet, no Abraham Lincoln has stepped forward to speak on behalf of what he called the better angels of the American experiment. You remember his arguments building up in the 1850s. A house divided cannot stand. America cannot continue half slave, half free. But when he was elected, he came from Springfield, Illinois, to Washington in February 1861, through Philadelphia, and gave a number of speeches in a single day and a half in front of Independence Hall. And he said that all his thinking came from the great documents that came from that building. And he finishes quoting Psalm 137, "May my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth if I'm unfaithful to these ideas." So he addresses the evils, the evil of slavery, the hypocrisy of slavery. He addresses them, but in the light of what he called the better angels of the American nature and the best of the American experiment. And to this point, no one has stepped forward with a similar sense of history and an address to those deeper first principles of the Republic. But why has that suddenly burst out so much this year, but over the last few decades? The answer, I think, is that 2018 is 50 years on from what Rudi Deutschke called the long march through the institutions. You remember when Antonio Gramsci sat in jail under Mussolini and wrestled with the failure of Karl Marx's view of how revolution would come. And he argued that unlike Marx, there would have to be cultural hegemony, domination, through the leading institutions of ideas in a society. And you can see that Deutschke, 50 years ago this year, in 1968, a very crucial year for many reasons, called for a long march through the worlds of the universities and colleges, the press and the media, and the world of entertainment. And 50 years on, in many ways, that long march has been successful. And many of the ideas coming out from the ideas institutions in America owe more to the French Revolution and its heirs, such as Friedrich Nietzsche, Antonio Gramsci, Wilhelm Reich, Herbert Marcuse, and of course, more recently, Michel Foucault. And when we look as the way this has touched politics, in a post-truth, and increasingly not only post-truth, but a post-rights world, you can see that we're left to a politics of power, which is incredibly dangerous to freedom. My book is an admirer from abroad calling for a national conversation on freedom and the character of the Republic. Alexander Hamilton spoke of reflection and choice. And was the American people able to do it or not? And in many ways, that is the issue today. And in a climate of conflict and incivility, is there sufficient leadership? Is there sufficient of a debate with respect for truth and for people to really examine the question, which view of freedom does America want to choose? And which view of the character of the American Republic does America want to follow? So the form of my book is actually a checklist. 10 questions for American citizens to ask, and each of them raises different issues which at this time deeply need to be resolved. Let me just mention briefly in the time we have this afternoon a few of those. First, and a very foundational one, where did freedom come from? It used to be clearly understood that those who came over, say, to New England were following what was called the ancient liberties of the English, as Winston Churchill put it. Everything WASP is thrown out, and now everything of white privilege is thrown out, so no one looks at that issue today. Most Americans, polls show, would say that the freedom came from Athens and Athenian democracy. But any of you know your own framers know how wary they were of democracy, Athenian style, and in fact, freedom did not come from Athens. It came from Sinai. And many Americans don't know that behind the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, 1787, is actually the precedent of the biblical covenant. Now, you can see as you explore that more deeply that democracy has zero social content. And today, for a whole number of reasons, is under extreme pressure. Whereas covenantalism and constitutionalism is rich with various principles for a free society. But Americans need again to explore, where does freedom come from? And many people have the wrong idea of the roots of American freedom. A second incredibly simple and yet profound issue is, what do Americans mean by freedom? Gertrude Stein said, a rose is a rose is a rose. Some things are just self-evidently whatever they are, but freedom is not like that. Freedom is nuanced. Freedom is elusive. Free societies rarely last, and if you take certain views of freedom, they come out in certain directions, and they're unsustainable, and they're unlasting. You can take many issues that underlie that simple question of definition. One of the simplest is freedom negative or positive or both? Negative freedom is freedom from. Anyone controlled by anything outside themselves, whether colonial power or drugs or alcohol or a bully, is not free. And freedom always starts with negative freedom, freedom from. But liberation, which is freedom from, is not liberty. Liberty is much more than liberation, far more than a revolution. And it needs positive freedom, freedom to be, which requires truth and an understanding of truth and a character and a way of life, so that freedom is not just the permission to do what you like, but the power to do what you ought, as Lord Acton put it. Yet you can see today, such as, say, libertarianism, there are views of freedom in this country which are frankly just unrealistic and will not last. And many people's view of freedom simply doesn't respect the challenges of what freedom requires. A third question, which is one very rarely asked, is, have Americans faced up to the grand paradox of freedom? I'm sure many of you have reflected on the Korean War Memorial and its prominent saying, freedom is not free. Brief, inspiring, obviously addressing what Abraham Lincoln again called the last full measure of devotion which a citizen gives by giving his or her life. But the paradox of freedom is much darker than that. Very simply, the greatest enemy of freedom is freedom. Freedom almost always undermines itself. Freedom runs into permissiveness and then license and then anarchy and rebounds to tyranny. Or freedom-loving people so love freedom, they do anything to be safe in their freedom, secure in their freedom. One nation under surveillance, and eventually they're not free. Or again, freedom-loving people will do anything to fight for freedom, including things unwittingly that are a contradiction of the freedom for which they're fighting. And in way after way, freedom undermines itself, and free societies have a habit of destroying themselves over time. As I said, America is the longest-running tutorial in the politics of freedom that human history shows anywhere, and yet today you can see many of the seeds of self-destructiveness that have brought down other societies because people are not looking at what the paradox of freedom requires. For example, as the great French philosopher Montesquieu points out, freedom requires structures of freedom, the law, the Constitution, and they can be laid down, lasting for a while. But freedom also requires the spirit of freedom, which has to be passed on from generation to generation, from parents to children, from teachers to students. And if it ever goes, the spirit of freedom, the structures by themselves will hold nothing together. Or you can see the ethical roots of the paradox. Freedom requires self-restraint of some sort. It is the freedom of the self-governed. But the only restraint truly appropriate to freedom is self-restraint. But self-restraint is precisely what freedom undermines when it flourishes. And you can see, as Edmund Burke put it, people have to know how to put chains upon their appetites, or freedom runs away with freedom and undermines itself. But the deepest reason for the paradox of all you can actually see in the scriptures, which are spiritual and psychological, though you can see it worked out in secular history too. Freedom requires a responsibility. But at the heart of our human inclination to go wrong is a refusal of responsibility, an evasion of responsibility. And in evading being responsible, very often free people would prefer tyranny. And there's a freedom in tyranny and a tyranny in freedom that comes out of the fear of the responsibility of self-reliance. And again you see this surprising paradox that freedom becomes the enemy of freedom. One of the key issues I've spoken on in this chamber before at Chaplain Back's wonderful invitation is a fourth question. Do Americans know how to sustain a world safe for diversity? The global question of our day is, how do we live with deep differences? And there's no question, no nation has come closer to that, maintaining extraordinary diversity of many backgrounds through the insistence that you have to have freedom of religion and conscience for everybody at its core. I've tried to fight for that in the 30-odd years I've been here. But I have to say with sorrow and sometimes with anger, it's hard to watch America squandering its great tradition in such a short time. And even in the last 20 years, there's been more of a sea change on these issues than in the previous 300 years put together. You can see what I call the reducers. Those who would like to say religious freedom and reduce it to free worship. But every dictator gives freedom of worship. Whatever you believe between your two ears, as long as your mouth is firmly shut and you're at home, freedom of worship. But that is not religious freedom and freedom of conscience, or what James Madison called free exercise. The second of the malignant 3 R's are the removers. And you can see in 20 years how freedom of religion has become freedom from religion, much of it openly stoked by people like Richard Dawkins openly admitting that it was 9/11, which made him see that religion in public life was destructive and violent, and we must remove it altogether. And there are many in this country arguing that way. But the third R is in many ways the deadliest today, which I call the rebranders. For the founders and for most American history, religious liberty and civil liberty were the twin brothers of freedom. And yet there are those today who are rebranding religious freedom as a form of bigotry and a code word for discrimination, and turning this human right upside down and inside out. America is taking what is surely one of its deepest and most precious gifts, or its greatest achievements, and in a very short time squandering it. One last question I'll mention, because it's so essential and yet very rarely raised today. What basis do Americans have for freedom? If you look historically, the Jewish people had their understanding of freedom through the Torah in a sea of neighbors who had no freedom. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, it was the stars that determined everything. Move down through history and you look at the Greeks. We owe them so much, but not freedom. Because behind everything was fate, moira, destiny. But if you look at the modern philosophical world today, there are umpteen forms of determinism. Historical determinism, economic determinism, social determinism, psychological determinism. We can look at Karl Marx or Spinoza or Freud, but move right down, say, to the new atheists. Sam Harris, what is freedom? It's a fiction. It's an illusion. We use the word, but there's no basis for it. And the more you look around, you see that the Hebrew and Christian scriptures are unique in their understanding of freedom. That God in his sovereignty is completely free, but he has made human beings in his image, not sovereign as he is, but significant. And freedom is one of those gifts through which humans most resemble their Creator. And you can see that that biblical grounding of freedom is quite literally in our modern world unique. And if we follow many of these other philosophies, they will give us various forms of determinism which are part of what is undermining human rights. When I was a student, many years ago now, you could see that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was taken as the Bible of human rights and the vanguard of what would sweep the world for human rights. Today, considered Western form of exceptionalism. But most importantly, if you look at the philosophical roots, many of those still proclaiming human rights have no foundation for it. And you can see in many circles today, we're not only in a post-truth world following Nietzsche, we are increasingly and dangerously in a post-rights world. So to look at many of the ideas in America, multiculturalism, political correctness, social constructionism, the sexual revolution, postmodernism, all these ideas go back to the Enlightenment and its heirs coming down through the French Revolution, through the gentleman that I mentioned earlier. They do not go back to the American Revolution and to the scriptures of the Jews and Christians behind it. And you can see that many of the incidents of today, say the kneeling controversy or much of what's behind the Kavanaugh hearings, again shows signs of these two things. So America now is at a Rubicon moment. America can no more remain half one view of freedom and half the other view of freedom than it could remain half slave and half free in the 1850s and 60s. Clearly, there needs to be leadership. If we look down through American history, from Lincoln and afterwards, it was clear that the Declaration, as Martin Luther King put it, was a promissory note. The Constitution with the 3/5 laws was defective. There was an evil and there was a hypocrisy at the heart of it. Liberty and justice for all? No. But the Declaration was a promissory note. The last great activist like that was Dr. Martin Luther King himself. As you move to Stokely Carmichael and move into the movements from the 1960s, you get closer to the idea that America is chronically racist, sexist, militarist, and all sorts of other things. Will there be a leader who addresses the better angels, addresses the evils, addresses the hypocrisies, addresses the unfulfilled and the incomplete, but sees the Declaration as that promissory note and calls America back to the brilliance of some of the founding principles? In other words, will America restore that founding vision and those founding principles? Or will America go the other way and replace them, as so many today are intent on doing? I mentioned covenantalism and its relationship to the Constitution. The great Jewish scholar Daniel Elazar, who put that on the map, he would argue very often in his many books and articles on the subject that covenants came out of an Asian context where you had oases. And as Elazar pointed out, oases are never more luxuriant and longer lasting than one simple consideration: the wellspring at its heart. An oasis will be healthy and flourishing if its wellspring is kept fresh and alive. And as Elazar said, that too is true of the Constitution. If the faiths that underlie the principles are alive and strong and active, the Constitution will be sustained. But if those faiths are undercut, the Constitution, like an oasis, will wither and die. But let me finish with that challenge to leadership being in this house of the Congress. Jenny and I love the story of a young, you mentioned I'm from Oxford, but I love the story of a young Cambridge don who was a philosopher and an atheist, but in World War II, when he was sent to the Middle East, took various books with him to read, and one of them was the Bible, which he'd never read. And in reading the Bible, he actually came to faith, but found himself in the army near Cairo with the morale at rock bottom, class divisions enormously divided, and he prayed to God. What was he to pray for the country in this situation? And this is the prayer that God gave him and he prayed every day, Lord, give us leaders such that it is to your glory to give us the victory through them. My wife and I pray that every day for America. Will there be a leader on the order of an Abraham Lincoln who will address the worst, but in the light of the best, and truly know how to speak to the better angels of the American nature? There has never been a country so committed to freedom as this one. The great St. Augustine would point out, you don't judge a nation by its, he didn't use the word GDP, but that's virtually what he meant. You don't judge a nation by its economy or by the size of its army or even the numbers of its population. You look what it loves supremely. Is there any question? I would say no as an outsider. What America loves supremely is freedom. But at this Rubicon moment, will America live up to the best of the founding vision of freedom of which you are the heirs? And my question to you is, will there be such a leader at this crucial time? And maybe who from this august body, the Senate, will stand forward to be that leader? Thank you.